When the spring thaw of 1878 finally allowed access to the isolated valley where Thomas Whitmore had spent the winter in his trapping cabin, the search party that had been waiting for months to verify his survival dug through the remaining snowdrifts, cleared the door that had been buried under 8 feet of accumulation since December, and entered the cabin expecting to find either Thomas alive and weakened from the hard winter, or Thomas dead from the cold or starvation that such extreme isolation could create. But they found neither. They found the cabin intact, found Thomas's belongings arranged as if he had been living there normally, found food supplies partially depleted in ways that suggested consumption through the winter months, found the stove containing recent ashes that indicated fire had burned within the past weeks, and found every indication that someone had been occupying the cabin through the winter that had just ended. But they did not find Thomas. They did not find his body. They did not find any evidence of where he had gone or how he had left a cabin that had been completely buried and inaccessible from outside from December through March, that had no windows large enough for a person to exit through, and that showed no signs of tunneling or digging that would indicate escape through the snow that had sealed the structure. Thomas Whitmore had entered his cabin in November of 1877, had been confirmed present when the first heavy snows made the valley inaccessible in early December, and had vanished sometime during the 4 months of winter burial. Vanished from a sealed cabin in ways that left no trace and that offered no explanation for how a man could disappear from a space that had no exits and that was surrounded by snow too deep and too compacted to allow passage, even if exits had existed. Welcome to this journey through one of the most complete and inexplicable disappearances ever documented in the Ozark wilderness. In the years when trappers working isolated territories often spent entire winters alone in cabins that became inaccessible once snow accumulated, when spring excavation of buried structures sometimes revealed bodies of those who had not survived the winter, when the physics of snow and shelter meant that anyone inside a buried cabin either remained inside until the cabin was excavated, or died inside, and was found when excavation occurred, when there was no mechanism by which someone could leave a snow-buried structure without creating evidence of their exit. There lived a man who vanished from such a structure without leaving any sign of departure, without creating any tunnel or passage through the snow that enclosed his cabin, and without providing any explanation in the possessions he left behind or in the condition of the cabin he abandoned, for where he had gone, or how he had gone there, or why he would choose to leave shelter during months when leaving meant certain death from exposure in a wilderness that offered no other refuge. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we trace the boundary between disappearance that can be explained by known mechanisms and disappearance that resists all explanation, because the known mechanisms do not account for what was found and what was not found when spring finally revealed what winter had concealed. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we excavate that cabin and try to understand how someone could vanish from inside it, consider what winter burial of structures meant, and why searchers understood that finding an empty cabin after winter was impossible if the cabin had been occupied when burial occurred. Snow that accumulated around and over a structure created a seal that was absolute. The snow was too deep to walk through, was too compacted to dig through without tools and extended effort, and completely enclosed the structure in ways that meant anyone inside remained inside until someone from outside dug down to create access. The cabin itself had limited openings: a door, perhaps 1 or 2 small windows, a chimney, and all of these openings would be blocked by snow once burial occurred. The door would be immovable from inside because snow piled against it would exceed human strength to push aside. The windows were too small for human passage, even if they could be opened against the snow. The chimney was too narrow for escape and would be filled with snow that had fallen down it during months of storm. The only way to leave a buried cabin was to tunnel through the snow, to dig a passage from the door or window outward through the accumulated snow until reaching the surface. But such tunneling would leave obvious evidence: disturbed snow, a visible tunnel or depression, displaced material that would remain visible even after additional snowfall. Searchers examining a cabin in spring could determine whether anyone had tunneled out by looking for these signs. If no tunnel existed, then no one had left. If the cabin was empty despite no tunnel, then the person who should be inside had vanished in ways that physics did not allow, had passed through solid snow without disturbing it, had exited through openings too small for human passage, or had ceased to exist within the cabin without leaving remains. Thomas Whitmore was 31 years old in the autumn of 1877, an experienced trapper who had worked wilderness territories for 9 years, who was known for careful planning and conservative decision-making, and who had survived multiple winter seasons in isolated locations without unusual difficulty. In September of 1877, Whitmore entered a remote valley approximately 35 miles northwest of what would eventually become Mountain Home, Arkansas, intending to trap through the autumn and early winter before departing in late December or early January, when his season's work was complete. The valley Whitmore chose was particularly isolated, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through difficult terrain, surrounded by ridges that made the valley a natural trap for snow, and known among trappers as a location that could become completely inaccessible during winter if heavy snow fell before departure occurred. The risk of the valley was balanced by its productivity. Game was abundant, fur quality was excellent, and trappers who worked the valley successfully could accumulate significant profit in a single season. But the valley demanded respect. It had to be entered early enough to establish camp and trap lines, and it had to be exited before the first major snowfall because snow that fell in the valley's confined space accumulated quickly and made the access trail impassable until spring thaw. Whitmore established his cabin in a location that previous trappers had used, a small structure that had been built years earlier, and that was maintained informally by those who used it. The cabin was basic: single room, stone fireplace, one door, 2 small windows, adequate for temporary occupation, but not designed for luxury or for sustained habitation beyond a single season. Whitmore stocked the cabin with supplies he expected to need: food sufficient for 4 months, ammunition, basic equipment, firewood gathered from the surrounding forest. He planned to work through September, October, and November, and to depart by mid-December at the latest. Well before the deepest winter made the valley impassable, through September and October, Whitmore's season progressed normally. He set trap lines, checked them regularly, accumulated furs, and managed his camp in ways that showed the competence of an experienced wilderness worker. In early November, he made a trip out of the valley to the nearest settlement, purchased additional supplies, and reported to the trading post operator that his season was going well, that he had good fur collection, and that he planned to remain in the valley through November and would depart by early December before weather made departure dangerous. This November trip was the last confirmed contact anyone had with Thomas Whitmore, while he was clearly alive and clearly present in normal circumstances. He returned to his valley, to his cabin, to his trap lines, and to the isolation that trapping required. Neighbors who lived at the valley's entrance, the Morrison family, whose homestead was positioned where the access trail met more commonly traveled routes, saw Whitmore pass through on his return from the settlement in early November. They did not see him leave the valley again. In early December, the first major snowstorm of the season struck the region. The storm lasted 3 days, deposited heavy snow, and created the kind of accumulation that made the trail to Whitmore's valley impassable. The Morrisons knew that Whitmore was still in the valley. They had not seen him exit, and the timing suggested that he had intended to remain there a few more weeks before departing, that the early storm had likely caught him before he was ready to leave, and that he would now be confined in the valley until spring, because once the trail was blocked by this much snow, no further passage would be possible until thaw cleared the route. This situation was not unprecedented. Trappers sometimes found themselves trapped for winter in locations they had intended to leave earlier. The confinement created hardship, but was survivable if the trapper had adequate supplies and if the cabin provided sufficient shelter. The Morrisons assumed that Whitmore, being experienced and being known for careful preparation, would have supplies enough to last until spring, would survive the winter in his cabin, and would emerge when the trail became passable again in March or April. Through December, January, and February, additional storms added to the snow accumulation. The valley became progressively more buried, more inaccessible, more isolated. No contact with Whitmore was possible, no way to check on him, no way to provide assistance if he needed it, no way to know whether he was surviving adequately or was in crisis. The Morrisons and other neighbors who knew Whitmore was in the valley could only wait for spring and hope that when excavation of the cabin became possible, they would find him alive or, if he had died, would at least find his body and understand what had gone wrong. March brought the beginning of thaw. Snow began to melt. The trail began to become passable, and the possibility of reaching Whitmore's valley and checking on his survival became realistic. By late March, a group of men, including Frank Morrison and several others who knew Whitmore, organized an expedition to reach the valley, to excavate the cabin if necessary, and to determine Whitmore's condition after 4 months of complete isolation. The journey to the valley took 2 days, despite the relatively short distance. The trail was still difficult. Snow remained deep in shaded areas, and progress was slow. When the searchers finally reached the area where Whitmore's cabin stood, they found a landscape still dominated by snow. The valley had accumulated massive amounts during the winter. Drifts were still 8 to 10 feet deep in areas where wind had piled snow, and the cabin itself was partially buried, with drifts covering the lower portions of the walls and completely blocking the door. The searchers began digging, clearing snow away from the door, creating access to the cabin that had been sealed since December. The work was exhausting. Even in late March, the snow was still compacted and heavy, and excavating required hours of labor with shovels and tools. But eventually, the door was cleared enough to be opened, enough to allow entry, and the searchers pulled open the door and stepped inside, expecting to find Thomas Whitmore either alive and weakened from winter, or dead from cold or starvation or illness. They found neither. The cabin was empty, completely empty of human presence. No Thomas Whitmore alive. No Thomas Whitmore dead. No Thomas Whitmore at all. But the cabin was not empty of Thomas's belongings. His possessions were there, his clothing, his equipment, his furs, his personal items. The cabin showed clear evidence of recent occupation. The stove contained ashes that were not ancient, that showed signs of fires that had burned within recent weeks rather than months ago. Food supplies were present, but depleted. What should have been 4 months of food was partially consumed in ways that suggested someone had been eating from these supplies through the winter. The cabin was arranged as if someone had been living there. Blankets on the bunk were positioned as if recently used. Items were placed around the room in patterns suggesting daily activity rather than long abandonment. Everything indicated ongoing habitation up until very recently, but no person was present. No body was present. No evidence of what had happened to Thomas Whitmore was present. Frank Morrison and the other searchers stood in the cabin trying to understand what they were seeing. A cabin that had been occupied through the winter. A cabin that showed no signs of violent death or struggle. A cabin that contained the belongings of the person who should be present, but who was not present. And most troubling, a cabin that had been completely buried for 4 months with no possible means of exit. The searchers examined the cabin systematically, looking for explanations. They examined the door. It opened inward, and the snow that had been piled against it from outside would have made pushing it open from inside impossible until someone from outside cleared the snow. They examined the windows. Both were intact. Both were too small for a person to pass through, even if the glass had been broken, and both were blocked from outside by snow that showed no signs of disturbance. They examined the fireplace and chimney. The chimney was narrow, was filled with debris and snow that had fallen down it during the winter, and showed no evidence that anyone had attempted to climb it or to use it as an exit route. They examined the floor and walls. Solid. No signs of digging. No evidence that anyone had attempted to tunnel down through the floor or out through the walls. They examined the snow outside the cabin. No tunnel was visible. No depression or disturbed area suggested that anyone had dug out from the cabin at any point during the winter. The snow around the cabin was level and undisturbed except where the searchers themselves had dug to reach the door. Morrison searched for a note, for any written explanation that Thomas might have left if he had known he was dying, or if he had planned to do something unusual. No note existed. He searched Thomas's belongings for any indication of illness or distress. The clothing and equipment appeared normal, showed no signs of blood or damage that would indicate injury, suggested a person who had been living normally rather than a person in crisis. The searchers expanded their search to the area around the cabin. They examined the snow within 100 yards of the structure, looking for any sign that Thomas had left the cabin and had attempted to travel away from it. They found nothing. No tracks in the snow that remained, no disturbance that would indicate a person had passed through, no evidence of anyone leaving the cabin and heading into the surrounding forest. They climbed to high points to see if they could spot Thomas's body somewhere in the landscape. Perhaps he had left the cabin somehow and had died from exposure nearby, and his body was lying somewhere under remaining snow. But the valley showed no signs of disturbance, no dark spots against white snow that would indicate a body, no evidence that anyone had traveled through the valley during the winter. Over the following days, the searchers conducted increasingly thorough investigation. They dug test holes in the snow around the cabin to see if Thomas's body might be buried in snow near the structure. They found nothing. They examined the cabin's contents item by item, trying to determine if anything was missing that might explain where Thomas had gone or what he had been doing. The inventory seemed complete. His furs were there. His valuable equipment was there. Even his personal items, like his pipe and his small amount of money, were present. Nothing suggested that he had packed to leave or had taken anything with him if he had somehow managed to depart. They interviewed each other about their observations, trying to piece together a timeline. The food depletion suggested consumption through most of the winter, perhaps into February or even early March. The ashes in the stove suggested fires within the past weeks or month. The arrangement of the cabin suggested someone living normally up until very recently. All evidence pointed to Thomas having been in the cabin through most or all of the winter, and having vanished only recently, perhaps in late February or March, when he might have theoretically been able to exit if the snow had begun to melt enough to make exit possible. But the snow had not melted enough. Even in late March, when the searchers arrived, the snow around the cabin was still 8 feet deep in drifts. In February, it would have been deeper. No one could have walked out of the cabin through that depth of snow. And even if someone could have, they would have left tracks, would have left disturbance, would have left some sign of passage. The snow showed no such signs. The searchers considered whether Thomas might have died, and whether his body might somehow be concealed within the cabin in a location they had not yet discovered. They tore apart the bunk, looking for a body hidden beneath it. They examined the floorboards to see if any had been removed and a body hidden below. They checked the chimney to see if a body might somehow be wedged in it. They found nothing. The cabin contained no hidden spaces large enough to conceal a human body, and every possible location had been examined. They considered whether Thomas might have left the cabin before the major snows of December. Perhaps he had departed in late November or very early December before the trail became impassable, and someone else had been in the cabin through the winter using Thomas's supplies and Thomas's cabin. But this theory failed because the Morrisons had been watching the trail and had not seen Thomas leave, and no other trappers were known to be in the valley. Additionally, if someone else had been using the cabin, where was that person now? They too had vanished, and the same impossibility of exit applied to them. They considered whether Thomas might have had a companion they didn't know about. Perhaps someone had been with him in the cabin through the winter, and that person had somehow managed to leave and had taken Thomas's body with them. But this seemed absurd. Why would anyone take a body? How would anyone manage to carry a body out through snow that was impossible to walk through, even without a burden? And why would Thomas's companion leave all of Thomas's valuable furs and equipment behind? Every theory they proposed encountered the same fundamental problem. The cabin had been sealed by snow from December through March. No tunnel or exit route existed, and anyone inside the cabin should still be inside the cabin, either alive or dead. But Thomas was not inside the cabin. He had vanished from a sealed space in ways that made no physical sense. The searchers remained in the valley for a week, conducting the most thorough search they could manage. They checked and rechecked every detail of the cabin. They searched the surrounding area repeatedly. They dug through snow in patterns that should have revealed any buried body or any disturbed area. They found nothing that explained where Thomas Whitmore had gone. Finally, having exhausted every investigative approach they could think of, the searchers had to accept that they had no explanation. Thomas Whitmore had vanished from a cabin that had no exits, during a winter when leaving meant death, without taking his belongings, without leaving a note, without creating any tunnel or passage through the snow, and without leaving any trace of where he had gone or how he had managed to go there. Morrison and the others gathered Thomas's belongings, loaded them onto pack animals, and returned to the settlement. They reported what they had found, or rather what they had not found, to the community of trappers and to Thomas's distant family. The belongings were eventually claimed by relatives. The furs were sold. The mystery was discussed and debated. But no explanation emerged that satisfied the fundamental question of how a man could disappear from inside a sealed cabin. In the weeks and months following the discovery of the empty cabin, various theories were proposed by those trying to make sense of the impossible disappearance. Each theory attempted to account for the evidence: the occupied cabin, the depleted supplies, the recent ashes, the complete absence of Thomas and his body. But each theory also had to confront the physical impossibility of exit from a snow-buried structure. Some suggested that Thomas had died from illness or accident early in the winter, and that his body had been consumed by animals that had somehow entered the cabin. But the cabin had been sealed. No large openings existed through which animals could enter. The door had been blocked by snow from outside, and the cabin showed no signs of animal intrusion or of the kind of scattered remains that animal scavenging would create. Others proposed that Thomas had managed to tunnel out through the snow despite the apparent impossibility, and that evidence of this tunnel had been obscured by subsequent snowfall or by wind that had filled in the tunnel after he departed. But the searchers had examined the snow carefully in late March, when much of it still remained, and no sign of any tunnel or disturbed area had been visible. Additionally, this theory required accepting that Thomas had chosen to leave the cabin during the winter, leaving behind all his furs, all his valuable equipment, and all his supplies, to walk through wilderness in conditions that would guarantee death from exposure. Why would anyone make such a choice? A few people whispered about supernatural explanations, that Thomas had been taken by something that did not follow normal physical rules, that he had vanished in ways that natural causes could not account for, that the wilderness held dangers beyond cold and snow and starvation. These explanations were generally dismissed by practical-minded frontier residents who did not believe in such things, but the whispers persisted because no practical explanation seemed to fit the facts any better than supernatural ones. The most unsettling possibility was that there was no explanation, that Thomas Whitmore had simply ceased to exist within that cabin, that he had vanished in ways that physics did not allow and that investigation could not explain, and that the empty cabin, with its evidence of recent occupation and its complete lack of its occupant, would remain a mystery that resisted all attempts to solve it. The cabin itself was avoided by subsequent trappers. The valley remained productive, remained a location where good trapping could be done, but the cabin where Thomas Whitmore had vanished was left unused. Those who knew the story felt that there was something wrong about the place, something that made staying in that particular structure seem inadvisable, even if no clear reason could be articulated for why one cabin should be different from any other cabin in the wilderness. Over the years, occasional visitors to the valley reported strange sensations near the abandoned cabin, feelings of being watched, sounds that seemed to come from inside the empty structure, impressions of presence where no presence should exist. These reports were often attributed to suggestion and to the power of the story to create anxiety in those who knew what had happened there. But the reports were consistent enough that the cabin's reputation as a place where something inexplicable had occurred became firmly established in the region's collective memory. Thomas Whitmore was never found. No body was ever discovered. No evidence ever emerged that explained where he had gone, or how he had left the sealed cabin, or why he would choose to abandon his possessions and his season's work to vanish into winter wilderness. The mystery remained complete. A man had entered a cabin, had been confirmed present when snow sealed the cabin, had apparently lived in the cabin through most of the winter, and had vanished from the cabin without leaving any trace of his departure from a structure that had no exits, and that was surrounded by snow too deep to allow passage. The case of Thomas Whitmore became one of the most discussed and most inexplicable disappearances in Ozark wilderness history, not because the circumstances were especially dramatic or violent, but because they were especially impossible, because they violated the basic physics of enclosed spaces and of snow and of human bodies that must go somewhere when they ceased to be where they were. Thomas was somewhere. Either he had left the cabin in ways that should have left evidence but did not, or he had died in the cabin in ways that should have left a body but did not, or something had happened that was so far outside normal experience that no framework existed for understanding it or explaining it, or preventing it from happening again to someone else who might choose to spend winter in an isolated cabin that could be buried by snow. and that could become a place where people vanish without explanation and without trace. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozark wilderness's most complete and inexplicable disappearances. A trapper who entered a cabin in autumn was confirmed present when winter burial occurred and vanished sometime during the months when the cabin was sealed, leaving behind his belongings and his season's work, but leaving no evidence of where he had gone or how he had managed to leave a structure that had no exits through snow, that allowed no passage. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory, where winter seals cabins and where sealed cabins sometimes become empty in ways that physics cannot explain, consider subscribing to Commutales for more stories that explore the boundaries between disappearance that makes sense and mystery that resists all explanation. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what might have happened to Thomas Whitmore. And if this story resonated with you, a like helps bring these narratives to more people. Until our next journey, remember that somewhere in the Ozark wilderness there is a valley where searchers once dug out a cabin that had been buried all winter and found the cabin intact, found evidence of recent occupation, found belongings waiting for an owner who would never return, but found no person, no body, no explanation for how someone could vanish from a sealed space during months when leaving meant death, and when staying should have meant either survival or discoverable remains.